IX.T and Hispano Buchon in for the break. second of the two chipmunks on the far side of the aerodrome, incidentally. The right-hand one is the Royal Chipmunk, the one on which several members of the royal family learned to fly, including the current King Charles. And another of our display participants later joining in the overhead, and a really welcome sight this. This is the Miles Falcon Major from Shipping and Airlines at Biggin Hill, which is the show because of a significant link between this type and the first flight of the Spitfire, which we're celebrating today.
So very busy out on the airfield, always a delight to see aircraft trundling around the sky on a lovely summer's day here. But the activities at the show do extend beyond the confines of the airfield itself. If you have visited Shuttleworth events before, you will probably be familiar with Shuttleworth House and the vintage bus rides that will transport you up there. Today, I'm afraid Shuttleworth House is closed for a private event, but you can nonetheless still ride buses and make your way along the front of the collection hangars where the restoration was completed. It took to the air again in October 2020, and it now wears the livery that it flew with in the spring of 1945. It is the only Spitfire in Soviet markings in the West, and it is the only known surviving airworthy Spitfire to have been used by the Soviet Air Force. And here it goes, heading for home.
Shuttleworth Spitfire, the Russian Spitfire just taking off runway 201.
Another very famous British fighter of the previous global conflict getting airborne underneath it, the Sopwith Camel.
Universally praised for its handling characteristics. The Camel, it was a little bit more complicated. It was pretty much the most agile aircraft in the sky at the tail end of the First World War, but it was also a notoriously difficult aircraft to fly. Was the Camel's weight distribution. 90% of the aircraft's weight was in the front 2 meters, which made the aircraft aerodynamically quite unstable, good for maneuverability, but bad for controllability. Its rotary engines also introduced some quirks. The Camel could turn 90 degrees to the left, would instead choose to turn the other way through 270 degrees.
But some of the Camel's characteristics could be exploited to advantage in combat. Its unexpected manoeuvring was useful to evade other airplanes, or it could be used to get onto the tail of an enemy less able to manoeuvre so aggressively. The Camel wasn't especially quick, but potentially it was very agile in the hands of an experienced pilot.
De Havilland began working on a new version called the DH-89 Dragon Rapide. Like the ill-fated Dragon Express, it was based on the Dragon, but this time it didn't suffer the same instability that made the Dragon Express such a handful.
And in the year of its first flight, the new aeroplane scored an early notable success in an event far better known for the involvement of another de Havilland aeroplane, the McRobertson Air Race between RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk and Melbourne, Australia. An early example was entered by the New Zealand Centenary Air Race Committee from Auckland in the hands of Squadron Leader James Hewitt and Flying Officer Cyril Kay. Sixth in the handicap section of the McRobertson, after which it was flown on from Melbourne to New Zealand to be delivered.
Exclusively existed to build the British designed under license up to that point.
Yeah, a very good aeroplane this was too. Excellent handling, a much more modern aeroplane than, for example, the Tiger Bomb that was designed to replace, almost self-evident, is a modern plane rather than a modern plane, and having things like these radio, close to cockpit, brakes, and flaps. Very, very successful. Well, what you need to built heavy flying service.
Most built under license in Portugal by OGNA. Those Chipmunks have been modified over the years. The Gypsy Major engines have been replaced with Lycoming 0360s, the wooden propeller replaced by a metal one, and there have been various improvements in the cockpit as well. And thanks to those modifications, incredibly, several Chipmunks remain in Portuguese service even today, 80 years on since the type first flew. And they're used for the grading and evaluation of pilot cadets and also for the training of flight instructors.
And for towing gliders, which they still use at the Portuguese Air Force Academy. And in fact, that glider towing role might well see them continue in service.
Being used as glider tugs, they are eminently suitable, so why replace them?
Yeah, very, very good aeroplane for that role, and the Portuguese ones are still in excellent condition, so it should work. This is the Shuttleworth Chipmunk, not an actual ex-Royal Canadian Air Force one, but it is in Royal Canadian Air Force markings. Landing before it, the Dragon Rapide, which is one of the many privately owned historic aeroplanes based here at Old Warden. This one owned by Philip Meeson, and it was the Shuttleworth Chief Engineer, Jean-Michel Hung, showing his typical panache in displaying it. And there's the Shuttleworth chief pilot, Paul Shakespeare, landing on with the Chipmunk.
There will be Provost and Anson going ahead. PO2 standby. Chipmunk, runway vacated. Chipmunk, thank you, check the park. PO2, A4, the 2 ahead to go for you. PO2. Taxi turn to the hole, QFE 1002. If you turn QFE 1002, PO2.
And they're having cooled the engine as usual for a few moments. The Shuttleworth Spitfire landing on after its part in that stunning display earlier with the Camel, and our thanks to Willie Hackett for flying the Spitfire.
PO2, runway 20, take off your discretion, 230 degrees, 12 knots. Take off my discretion, PO2.
And getting ready to fly. Here's an aircraft that's very familiar to us here at Old Warden, but which is an extreme... Yes, that was until 1944 when permission was given to Nikolai Polikarpov to give his aeroplanes the PO designation. Now, this aircraft was very successful as a trainer, but it rapidly found innumerable other applications, far too many to list here. But among the early ones were use on agricultural duties, very important in the areas where this aircraft was operating. They found work as air ambulances, different versions. Southern Rhodesia with a clear nose for bomb aimer training. Then there was the T-21, a navigation trainer, and the T-22 to train signallers. And in fact, it was a Mark 21 that was the last Anson built. And compared with the earlier Ansons, the 19 that we see here had a higher roof line, it had bigger cabin windows, the undercarriage and flaps were operated hydraulically rather than manually. It had been conceived to meet an interim requirement for a feeder liner. Now, the Provost had a slightly unusual configuration for its day, because instead of the pilot and instructor sitting one behind the other, they were positioned side by side in a shared cockpit. This wasn't completely unheard of, but it definitely wasn't the more normal configuration. And it allowed the instructor to demonstrate procedures more easily and also to better observe their student. Yes, the RAF has chopped and changed, hasn't it, over the years between side-by-side and tandem seat trainers. One thinks of the transition of this design from the piston engine Provost we see here to the later jet Provost. That too was a side-by-side configuration, but then the JP was replaced by the short. Presented a little bit of a challenge as far as instrument training was concerned, because with the pilots, the result was that the instructor could still see out of the window perfectly well, but to the students the windows would appear blacked out, and this would force them to fly exclusively off instruments. It was a very, very well-loved aeroplane in RAF service, the Provost. It must be said it wasn't difficult for Percival to improve on what had gone before, given that it succeeded the pretty dreadful Prentice. But the handling of the Provost won a lot of praise, plenty of power from the 550 horsepower engine. For restoration to flights, they actually had to knock down a wall of the building to get the aircraft out.
Okay, sit on my chair, please.
It was with Tim Manner's organisation, Kennett Aviation and until it was sold to Shuttleworth in 2001, so it's now been with the collection a quarter of a century, and it's in the colours not of an RAF trainer but of a Provost that was sold to the Sultan of Oman's Air Force, because there was quite an export market for these, and which had RAF roundels painted on it for the delivery flight. And this is now, quite incredibly, the Spitfire is going to track the aircraft restoration company's Buchon. As the two fighters start their engagement, we're going to hear two voices. One of them is that of the famous RAF fighter pilot of World War II, Richard Hillary, who started flying Spitfires with number 603 Squadron during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. Claimed 5 EF-109s shot down in the space of just a week of combat, plus 2 probables. Operational Conversion Unit pilot with number 54. Operational Training Unit at Charter Hall in Scotland.
And I was being strapped in, my mind automatically checking the controls, and we were off.
sir.
Steve Jones with the aircraft restoration company's Buchon. And the victor in that little RAF versus Luftwaffe joust, Dave Ratcliffe in the Arco and aerial collective Spitfire 9T. Pilot conversion sortie, so some of you at least may have had the chance to witness it airborne. And rather like at our Wings and Wheels show earlier in the year, Brisket and Spit in the air at once. As MH434 touches down, that'll be featuring in the programme later. But he is one of the great fighting aeroplanes of the 1914-18 war, but one that took some refining. The Bristol F2A version was the first of the Bristol. wasn't so much the aircraft that was to blame for this, but the tactics. Those Bristol F-2As had primarily been employed flying straight and level in close formations and using the rear gun solely to ward off aggressors. Which was faster and had a better rate of climb, became exceptionally successful, able to switch rapidly from offense to defense and vice versa.
Attributes of the Bristol F-2 very substantial. Demonstrated. It was developed at a time when Sopwith design was seeing a great deal of success, but the company was keen to produce a slightly more daring experimental product to push the envelope of what might be possible. The idea was to develop a triplane rather than a biplane. And that meant the wings could each be smaller, while between them still producing the same amount of total lift. It gave for a better field of view from the cockpit. It also allowed for additional sets of ailerons to be fitted, boosting the aircraft's roll performance.
But what emerged was the first triplane design to see operational military service. It came about in large part because of what was known as the Fokker scourge of 1915, the shock caused by the appearance over France of Imperial German Air Service Fokker E-3 Eindecker monoplanes. And the Sopwith triplane was produced in an astonishingly compressed timescale. Trials.
Proposed an alternative solution to that great aerodynamic debate. What do you do when you feel the biplane has reached the limit of its capabilities? Do you put more wings on, as with the Sopwith triplane, or do you attempt to take one set of wings off? Who was the chief designer of the Bristol Aeroplane Company, believed that one of the most important factors going forward in aircraft design would be drag reduction. So he developed this aircraft as a private venture. Early tests vindicated his design philosophy because the prototype was able to hit speeds of 128 miles an hour during early test flights. It could comfortably fly at least 30 miles an hour faster than any of its German adversaries. Nonetheless, Ben, not everyone was convinced.
No, Major General Hugh Trenchard, best known slightly later as the father of the Royal Air Force when it was formed as an independent service in April 1918, was then the commander of the Royal Flying Corps in the field on the Western Front, and he told the War Office no more of the new Bristol monoplanes should be ordered.